Welcome, everyone. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the first session in our Gallagher Partnership panel series, Guarding the Gate, High Security Site Design and Best Practices. I'm Natalie Bannon. I'll be the moderator today. As we know, the security landscape is consistently changing, and for high-risk environments like critical infrastructure, government sites, research labs, and utilities, the stakes are higher than ever. Traditional approaches aren't always enough anymore. So today we're going to be diving into what really takes to secure these kind of sites with flexibility and confidence. I'm thrilled to be joined with these wonderful gentlemen who are a group of experts who bring hands-on experience in physical security design, operations, tech integration. Hopefully, we'll be talking to quite a few points. So whether you're thinking about deterrence versus detection, planning for the unexpected, or bringing your systems together in smarter ways, hopefully we'll have something for you that you find interesting. But before we jump in, let's get started with a few quick intros. So Sean, Matt, and Joe, if you can introduce yourself. And Sean, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everyone. My name's Sean Wallace. I'm the Director of Critical Infrastructure for Unlimited Technology. We're a nationwide systems integrator. Prior to that, I was with two startup companies in cybersecurity. And before that, I ran the transmission and distribution group for a large electric utility. So I've been in the critical infrastructure space probably about 20 years. And in security specifically, probably about 6 of those years. So I've seen pretty wide span of what is going on between electric utility, data center, and oil and gas. And I'm on the Utility Advisory Board for SIA.
Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Adamson. I am the Security Program Manager for Cloud HQ. We are a developer, owner, and operator of hyperscale data centers. I am a ACES board certified PSP. I've been in the data center world, security specific, for the last 12 years. I am responsible for everything security related, from design to construction to maintenance of existing systems, and happy to be here.
Hi, Joe Baker, Managing Director of IoT Hybrid Solutions, based out of Seattle. We're a Division 27 and Division 28 design consulting firm and an IoT managed service provider. I've been in technology about 35 years. Notably, 10 of those years are with the United Nations. I was responsible for electronic security globally, which included strategy, planning, administration, across access control, video surveillance, and perimeter detection. For the past 18 years, I've been part of the electronic security consultancy, providing design, administration, and advocacy services. I've got certifications, CCIE with Cisco, and also I'm an RCDD. And also, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So let's get started by level setting. Designing for high-risk sites isn't just about adding more barriers. It's about designing with intent and resilience. So Sean, from your experience, what's different about designing physical security for high-risk sites?
I think in our industry, we have this idea of kind of the physical security standard design, right? Where you take a site, you put in fencing, you have your perimeter set up, and then maybe you have a gate with access control. Then you have, cameras, maybe LiDAR, radar, and then additional layers of access control and methods of detection inside the building. And that's, I think, the approach that's taken most often. But at the same time, imagine you're an asset owner of a site, and you're on the physical security team, and an executive from your company or even a potential customer comes to you and says, how do I know this site is secure? The typical answer that I hear is kind of a review of all the technologies that are in place. Oh, well, let me tell you, we have the fence, we have the gate, we have the LiDAR, we have the cameras, we have additional access control in the building, we have cameras in the building. But my experience is that doesn't really answer the question of, is the site secure, does it? High risk sites, then, I think demand another level of interrogation when you're really thinking about the design. You have to consider who the adversary is. A lot of locations, what they're really looking at is kind of, maybe low-level theft or some kind of form of vandalism. But, for those of us here that deal in critical infrastructure, we're looking at potential pressure groups trying to have an impact, and even nation state threat actors, and theft of intellectual property. those adversaries are going to be a lot more determined than kind of your run-of-the-mill threat and vandalism. So you really need to start your design with that adversary in mind. And one of the things I advocate is that you create something that's called an attack sequence diagram, where you take the persona of the adversary and then figure out how would they actually try to penetrate through my defenses to get at the crown jewels or achieve their goal with the facility. And you run through these scenarios. That does a number of things. One, it builds your confidence that the systems you have are already in place. Two, it's a paper exercise. So we're not talking about a lot of money here or a big investment, but it's the perfect way to challenge the design that you already have or use for a design basis when you're actually creating it for the first time. And the best part is it allows you to answer that first question really well. How do I know the site is secure? Well, we ran these tabletop exercises with these adversaries, which we think are the most likely ones to try to compromise my facility. Here are those results of those exercises. You can see we have multiple opportunities for prevention and detention. And after we ran all those, you'll find that nobody got through, and then we refresh those on a regular basis. That's a much better answer than just giving him a technology laundry list. And I think high-risk sites kind of demand that extra step in really understanding who the adversary is and kind of going through that motion with your facility.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Matt, sorry, I saw that you took yourself off mute. Were you going to add something? Otherwise, I was going to lead into another question that I think pivots really well.
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, cool. Actually, maybe I'll throw it to you, Matt, though. So here we go. It kind of made me think of what you were talking about, Sean, and when you're securing high-risk environments, deterrence and can be just as critical as detection and response. And you were kind of talking through a few of those examples with cameras versus gates and things like that. And so I'm curious, balancing all three isn't really that easy. So Matt, maybe if you could talk about what role does deterrence play versus detection and response, that could be an interesting topic.
Sure, yeah. Just deterrence and detection can't really be looked at as individual concepts. They're really synergistic elements in a layered security approach. Effective deterrence can actually reduce the workload of your detection mechanisms, and detection can actually trigger deterrence. It does start with what Sean touched on, completing a comprehensive security assessment to evaluate the site, the environment, threats, adversaries, and that'll help you determine the required security posture, which will help you determine where that deterrence layer begins. For example, a lower security site might not have gates, might not have a perimeter fence line, and that deterrence layer may not start until the actual secured front door of the facility. The reason this is low security is because now the general public has access to your property, and they're not really discouraged from entering until they get to that front door where they're met with security. So you can take care of the low-hanging fruit, the general public, curious citizens, mischievous youth, taggers, loiterers, with passive deterrence such as perimeter fencing and signage. And by starting there, you actually deter the low-risk actors, and that reduces stress on your systems and people, allowing them to focus on detection for higher threats. For more secure sites, active deterrence is what you would want to use. And this is where deterrence and detection kind of intersect, using detection methods to trigger active deterrence. This can be accomplished with motion detection, security lighting, fence line perimeter cameras that trigger audio warnings to scare people off. I've even seen some really cool technology pairing ground-based radar with drones. Detects an individual and launches a drone to their location based off of the ground-based radar. And it gives you a mobile annunciator and essentially a mobile PTZ camera, which is pretty cool. It is important, though, to know your regional laws and local social norms when landing on technology for your security posture. For example, in Northern Virginia, I would love to have electrified pulse monitored fence perimeter, but the AHJs won't have that here. But for example, in Brazil, it's something that's acceptable and can be used there, which is great. So know your laws, know the AHJs and their expectations and what you can and can't do where you're at. It's also important to note that deterrence doesn't stop at the front door. The exterior layer obviously handles the external threats, but additional layers should exist within your building to deter insider threats and bad actors. Signage reminding people that they're under 24-hour camera surveillance, multi-factor authentication at critical doors, anti-passback and tailgating technology are just a few of those that you can use within the building as well.
Perfect. It is kind of interesting what you said about, like the electrified fence. We have some people that are always sitting there like, I really wish I could use this, but I can't, right? And so understanding those laws is really key, and having I guess, right, a lot of people like to have a baseline of what they want to use, a standard, so to speak, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be the same at every single location. And being able to be flexible enough within the plan to look at what is allowed locally can make a big difference. So that makes sense. One of the other things that you just started to touch on, but maybe someone else can expand on it, is that internal versus external, you know, deterrence, because you mentioned some like cameras and the biometrics, but even having like guard tours, right, is another thing, and making sure that you're doing guard tours where it's not the same. We all see the movies where everyone has the same route at the same time, and so making sure that it's dynamic enough that people don't know what's going on, but it is a deterrence because they know that there's guards walking around, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you definitely don't want to fall into a routine with your patrols. Have frequent patrols, but infrequent as far as the timing of them is definitely a good practice, a best practice.
Awesome. So one of the things when we're talking about deterrence and detection as well, right? And you mentioned quite a few different technologies there, Matt. And so, as technology advances, convergence becomes both a challenge and an opportunity. And so maybe, Joe, we could talk about a little bit how you think about integrating command and control in systems in a way that actually enhances situational awareness, but doesn't overwhelm operators.
Sure. Great. Thank you. So from a consultant and design perspective, there's a pretty structured methodology that my team has used for years that it really works. And this could be for command and control. This could be for identity management. Any kind of large platform that you're interested in doing, there's like a 4-step process that we want to look at. Starting with assessment and discovery, and really looking at, what do you currently have? Who are your stakeholders? What are their requirements? What's currently in place? And coming up with a gap analysis, which essentially gives you a good picture of, what don't you have today? What do you want tomorrow? And the gap analysis will help create your requirements. So this way you can try to fill in those gaps with whatever your end solution needs to be. When looking at command and control, it's really like a single pane of glass. It allows you to correlate access control, video, intrusion detection, and more modern systems today allow you to tie into risk management tools so you can get things like weather, social data, and when there's a higher risk threat happening, the command and control system can help correlate that information in, raise your threat status internally, and then leveraging standard operating procedures for an operator to help really streamline their operations. The second thing we really want to look at is, what are all the requirements that are necessary? There are operational requirements, there are technical requirements, and there'll be functional requirements that are all needed in order to really figure out what is the system that you want to really deploy, and then rolling that into a whole strategy around architecture. What is going to be that approach? Who are we going to select? Leveraging maybe requests for information to 3, 4, or 5 different companies, understand what it is that their offering is, looking at their pricing model, how do they scale, what does their roadmap look like, what kind of integrations do they have that exist, and what has happened in the past in my world, when you come into a system that maybe there's a legacy access control system that doesn't have any type of API or way to connect to it, how do you bring that data in and still make it valuable so you're still collecting? And we had to look at creating an application to emulate a printer. So this way, when an event happened, it converted that text into a stream that, in this case, the PSIM could ingest and at least receive data. It wasn't bidirectional, but looking at creative ways when maybe as an organization, there's not a business case to replace all your platforms. How do you overlay something that is modern, that's got current protocols and processes, and still dovetail into very legacy or old technology? So looking at that from an engineering perspective and from an implementation perspective are really important. And then the last thing is really the implementation strategy. big fan of going to proof of concept. I love to do bake-offs, bring in several manufacturers, have a structured approach as far as here's how we're going to connect, what is the output that we expect, share that with operational teams so they can see the different UIs, see how do they resonate with how well things work or not work, from the mapping to the SOPs to closing out an incident, generating your reporting, looking at dashboards with KPI data or threat levels. So really looking at that as a whole to make sure that it does work for that organization. You can always say you want to buy a truck, but do you want a Toyota? Do you want a Ford? Do you want a Chevy? They all look a little different. They all drive a little different, but they're all trucks. So it's really what is the best fit for the organization based on your culture, based on the technology in place, and how does that then get moved forward out of the proof of concept into the next phase, which is really looking at procurement and then the implementation strategy. So looking at all of that is kind of our structured approach around, how do you roll out these large scale systems and try to make it effective for operations.
I heard you say bake off and I was like, is it because your last name's Baker? So you like bake off. But aside from that, there was also some interesting things that you had mentioned. You use the word like piece them, creative ways. Oftentimes, I think people think of converging systems being really expensive, especially when you start using some of those terms, right? And so what is the ROI in converging those systems? And if one of you guys could talk about that for a second, where do you see some of the benefits? Matt, I think you and I have talked about this before, how it can reduce operators' time and things like that. So maybe if you could dive into it a little bit.
Absolutely. So as an end user, integration, we actually don't even consider a lot of technologies unless they will integrate with our access control or our video management system, which is actually integrated with our access control. But our goal is to try and give our guard force as much information on a single pane of glass, because we hate what I call swivel chair processes. This goes all the way back to, you've got an access control system, and then you've got an access request system. They're disparate systems. They don't talk to each other. Now you're asking a guard to swivel from one system, swivel their chair to another, and manually enter that data. The less keystrokes the guard force has to do to accomplish their job, and the less clicks that they have to do, the less decision making, the more information you can give them, the better able they're going to be able to handle all of your situations. Even going as far down as systems that allow you to put in alarm notes. Guard force will get an alarm, have a camera, camera view, camera pop-up that shows exactly what happened at the time of the event, a live view of the event, as well as alarm notes or alarm instructions rather that'll pop up that if maybe they've never experienced that alarm before, it will give them step-by-step instructions on what they're supposed to do based on their SOPs, based on their post orders. So giving them all of that information definitely helps in that way. From an ROI perspective, I'll just use data centers for an example. These buildings are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as we go, right? AI is driving these buildings to become larger and larger, and that's a lot of ground to cover on foot for a guard. If you've got client SLAs that require a 5-minute response time, but you have a 1.5 million square foot building, you're going to have to staff that with a lot of guards in order to get that response time to respond to an alarm. So if you don't have camera coverage of those areas and you don't have camera pop-ups or camera call-ups when those alarms happen, you're dispatching a guard every time. With this technology, though, you can now have a guard see that alarm, see exactly what happened, triage it, determine whether it requires a response, and in that way, you're able to reduce the guard force required to secure that property.
Probably helps with reduce false positives as well, right? The more you have integration, the more viewpoints you have. So if you think about ROI, like you said, in swivel chairs movement is what you called it, but also with the false positives, right? So it's not always about the dollar value. It can be equated to dollar when you look at time for labor and things like that. But there's other ways to think of it. So yeah, I think that was.
Yeah, I think another way to look at it too, if you're trying to pitch some of this to your higher level folks is SLAs as far as data center operators go are becoming more and more stringent. Those service level agreements are tying us into things like I said, 5-minute response times. So we may not be looked at as a revenue generating department, but we can definitely mitigate risk of having to have a lot of that money going out to SLA violations and things of that nature.
And reputation, right? Since you said risk, reputation is another big one. So yeah, all these different things to think about when you're looking at ROI. So pivoting a little bit, redundancy is a really common theme for high security operations. But as we know, not all failover plans are created equal. So Sean, what kind of failover plans are essential for these type of operations? And Joe, it might also be interesting to hear your perspective on this as well. But Sean, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. So when you look at high-risk sites, a lot of them are going to have some kind of compliance component when it comes to like physical security, and usually especially access control when it comes to things like employee safety. So when you're looking at systems that might have a probability of failure, those are the places where I would tend to go first is for the compliance areas. Usually they're more urgent and it's a little easier to get budget to actually mitigate some of the risks that might come from a failure of one of those systems. But stepping back maybe a little bit after compliance, in the oil and gas industry and actually in the power industry, we have this thing called FMEA, failure modes and effects analysis. It's a very structured way of looking at systems and how they might fail, what the effect of that failure is. And then once you have that information, you go back and determine if the risk is acceptable or if there are things you need to do to mitigate that risk. So you could run kind of a basic FMEA on your physical security system and see if the output of the failure is acceptable. A lot of times, I think people will consider like power outages as kind of the number one, right? That's usually where a lot of people go. Or you may have cameras coming out of a cabinet. Maybe that cabinet catches on fire, taking out some of your physical security system. Those can be pretty easy to analyze and understand. But maybe there's some of you on this call that are using a cloud-based video management system. Imagine if that link just went down. You didn't do anything wrong. It really becomes a software cloud issue on their end, but you've lost complete access to your VMS, including, whatever records are up there in the cloud and, the instant information that's providing you already. So again, I kind of like the paper exercise and the planning component. So step back, really look at, first your compliance requirements, then second, kind of the major components of your physical security program, and figured out if those components failed, what's the backup plan? And that can be done, on a tabletop. And again, I think I talked about it earlier. You do these it doesn't cost any money, but it is extremely powerful because again, it gives you another communication tool to go up and say, hey, if we lose this part of the system, it's going to create a real compliance problem for us. So here's what we're proposing as a backup plan. And then that becomes proceduralized somewhere that people have access to and maybe even do some training on it. But those are some of the things that I would recommend. In the end, does the failure of this component of your system, be it the physical security system or your access control, does that introduce a vulnerability now into your facility? And what liability do you have as the physical security system owner that comes along with that liability? And that's a big important, I think, component to really think about all that. So really take those elements into consideration, tabletop it first, and then kind of determine where your risks are, what you really need to do, and then you can kind of prioritize budget based on what comes from that output.
I will say, just on the camera example, I'm a huge proponent of recording at the edge. If you can record at the edge onto SD cards on your cameras, I would highly recommend looking into that if you're not doing it already.
Yeah, and I would take a little bit different approach. The particular platform failing or component failing, everything Sean said is spot on, right? But I would also consider, is there a branding issue that Matt mentioned earlier? When something fails, you now need to look at involving other teams, not just compliance, but maybe legal, maybe facilities, maybe HR. Is there a business continuity component here that has happened? And is there other risk that need to be looked at that are just beyond, physical security as a lens, but more as the business as a whole? So depending on what that event is, it might have to be escalated into a broader team or a committee that has oversight, that might have input and have their own set of processes and things that they need to do in order to help protect the company as a whole while security is doing their job.
Probably good to have a combination of things and doing things, one way and then doing it another, because when you're talking about redundancy, especially in these environments, you want to make sure you get it right. So all good advice. So even the best systems, right, can fall short without well-trained people behind it. And I think we talk about training a lot, but sometimes it gets an oversight. So Joe, what kind of operational training should be in place for these types of sites?
So there's an obvious answer, right, which is document and train people on it and do their drills. And that's kind of like the right there answer. Everybody knows to do those things. But where I think things fall short is really doing drills, not telling operations that we're doing a test and do simulation testing. Let's have somebody climb over a fence and see, one, is the systems working the way they're supposed to, but more importantly, are the operators meeting the SLAs that Matt mentioned before, and are they able to dispatch that individual or individuals to see what's happening? So I'm a big advocate of building out your plan, doing the training, and then randomizing the testing. It's maybe sometimes fire, sometimes it's intrusion, sometimes it's let's force an open somewhere. Let's do things that an actual bad actor would do, and that allows you to, one, confirm that the operators and the field guards know their work, they're doing their work, and it also helps along lines of making sure the systems are functioning properly as well.
Matt, what about from your perspective? I think we've talked about training before. I know you put your team through some trainings.
Yeah, what I really like is when an access control manufacturer has training available that we can pass on to our guards, actual training modules on how to be a system operator. We've seen huge gains in the knowledge of our guard force by being able to provide those sort of things. So if your access control manufacturer does provide that kind of training or provides any sort of online learning modules that you can pass on to your guard force, it's highly beneficial.
Yeah, and actually you mentioned something earlier, Matt, when we were talking about deterrence and detection, is the alarm instructions. So even if you're not able to get someone into training, there's things that organizations can do to help their operators right off the bat, right? Which if there's alarm instructions and they know how to read, they should be able to follow that even if they haven't gone through the official training, but then making sure, like what Joe said, is putting people through the training, do the tests, make sure that everyone knows what they're expected of them.
Yeah, and then I will agree with the penetration testing. We do that on a regular basis, and it's a mixed bag as far as the responses go, right? So it's always good to do those and find where the weaknesses lie and where improvements can be made.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about external threats. So maybe we should talk about insider threats, because the stakes are definitely high in high trusted environments. And it'd be interesting to kind of get your insight on this. So Sean, how can organizations keep trust intact while still implementing effective monitoring and safeguards?
Yeah, there's really a couple ways. And, when you look at insiders, I think that's probably the most acute threat vector that a lot of us face that's not recognized. We've talked a lot about design today, which I think is really good. But I mean, let's just be brutally honest with ourselves. When's the last time you heard of somebody brute forcing a data center and getting all the way into the core or the red zone? It kind of doesn't happen because we have these security parameters set up. We have the training that we just talked about, and everything is pretty robust, designed for that threat. But your insider really comes in three flavors. And I've talked about this kind of like in other venues where you have your incompetent insider, which is just an employee who makes a mistake that has some impact on your operations. But then you have a compromised insider. And what's happening is with AI and social engineering, they're finding individuals and organizations, blackmailing or compromising them to commit malicious act inside the organizations for some end. Okay, that's a compromised insider. You're going to be seeing that happen with increasing frequency. And then the third category really is a malicious insider. So this is where the individual themselves have some, a complaint against the company. In critical infrastructure, we do have foreign actors that are there who could be called upon if necessary to commit some kind of act if they're insiders in the organization. So the defense of the organization and its employees from these insiders really falls on the physical security team, right? Because here we are doing the defense deterrence, we're doing the access control, and maybe coordinating, hopefully, with the cybersecurity team on looking at patterns of life for individuals and trying to find these insiders. But your focus, I think, on these high security sites should always include that persona and even put additional emphasis on it. One of the ways that I counsel people to defend against insiders, and this is for like very important substations. You might have like a high voltage substation, like 500 kV or 765 or something like that, or even in like red zone or like a core of a data center is kind of too deep working. So you, instead of having one individual go in by themselves, you have two individuals. That does get a little expensive because you're doubling up on the labor for like whatever that task is. But I'll tell you, it's a great way to mitigate insider threat is to have not only the monitoring that's going on in that area, but you've also got kind of one person watching the other while the work is actually being done. Some of those things, I think, you're going to be seeing, more and more of the future as this insider threat, I think, becomes a little bit more acute than what we're seeing even currently.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say least privilege access is a big one that a lot of organizations don't seem to follow, but it is a very easy way to mitigate some of the insider threat risk, right? Least privilege access, least privilege access as opposed to role-based. Only give folks the ability to do exactly what they need to do within your systems. And then make sure that that's documented, as well as change management, tracking changes so that when a change happens and you're not aware of it, you can go back against that change management log and check that as well, to maybe detect something that happened that shouldn't have.
And I would maybe just interject and take that one step further and look at just-in-time access, which is when you go up to a particular space, even though you're authorized to go in until a few things have happened, right? You go up to it, access is then provided, and then you're allowed in. Also working with cybersecurity folks to ensure things like USB ports are disabled, any type of new host that is brought into a particular network is, allowed to get in and do what it needs to do. So creating the physical barrier, creating the logical barrier, in addition also to what Sean said, by having maybe a second person, all of these things kind of collective really starts to bring that risk down a little bit. But it requires setting up that process and then executing it and then maintaining it along with like the change management that Matt mentioned.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. I'm going to switch over to questions so we can maybe get a couple of them in. All right. Let me see here. Let me just get to it. All right, there's a question in the Q&A. Hi, everybody. A question to the panel. At our financial institution, physical security is often seen as a necessary evil. For example, we've kept the same traditional security guard model for over 20 years, and improvements typically happen only after an incident. How can we better, there's, I think, two-part questions. How can we better communicate to leadership that security should be seen as a business enabler, not just a cost? And how do we shift the mindset from reactive to preventative and from warm bodies to professionalized, proactive security roles? Not sure who wants to take that one.
Okay, I'll take it, I guess.
Yeah, I could add to it. I could add to it, Joe, if you want. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. All right, go ahead if you want, if you have your thoughts together.
Yeah, so I mean, that is, I think, one of the most difficult challenges that everyone here faces, right? Like I've never met somebody in critical infrastructure security that says they want less security. What really happens is we try to get the most risk reduction for the amount of budget that we're allowed to have. So I think the root of your question And it's something that I'm sure, a lot of people are struggling with. It really comes down to the budget question. How do I justify additional budget I need to upgrade my technology to create maybe a more frictionless experience with physical security? I think the question used the term like business enabler. That can sometimes be difficult because it's hard for us to demonstrate a return on investment because security is usually a cost center. But there are new things out there that can help you get budget. We've got a few customers that are starting to use NFC on cell phones instead of badges. That could actually be a pretty substantial cost savings, and the employees like it because what you're finding is employees will sometimes forget their badge at home, but they'll never forget their cell phone. Then at the same time, they're using two-factor authentication built into the cell phone, like your thumbprint or your face, as additional security when it comes to like access control and using the same device for vendor management. So I guess where I'm going there is it's really looking at what you have and taking a step back. And with the systems you have currently, if there are friction components there that you could reduce or eliminate by moving to a higher technology, that can get the ear of somebody that maybe is not responding to the whole risk problem that we all face, right? Like, oh yeah, I'd love to get rid of badges. I hate them. It's like, okay, well that allows us to kill two birds because I can get rid of badges, saving money, but then I can also move to a more advanced system that is easier to maintain, maybe has a lower total cost of ownership, and is frictionless for the employees, or at least reduces the friction. So those kind of elements are where the focus has to be, and see if you could sell your way up to the executive management or whoever the owners are of the funding that you would need to get the budget to upgrade the systems. That's one way of doing it. The other way is, just a full-on risk approach. Like if you identify the vulnerabilities in your system and you equate those with business risk, business disruption, employee safety, different buckets, then if you could put a dollar number to that, it's an open liability that the company either has to address by spending money and closing the vulnerability, or somebody in the legal team has to put a letter to the file that says, yeah, we're aware of this vulnerability. We've decided we're not going to spend any money on it. We're just going to hold that inside the organization.
Awesome. I know we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get to one more question, and then we'll look at the other ones later and answer them. But this one got a couple of thumbs up. So what are the common misconceptions about critical infrastructure, security systems, and access control that can lead to vulnerabilities or misinformed decisions?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I think we talked about the big one right here. When we look at our threat actors, we talked about kind of the different flavors, I think maybe a couple times through this panel, right? We have like, low level vandalism, threat, pressure groups, nation states. But the security systems design that we put in are usually there to address those kind of things. And the insider threat sometimes gets pushed away, or it's not at the table. And I think that would introduce vulnerabilities into the system. If when you're designing your physical security and your access control program, looking at those other threat actors that are in place, if you're not really thinking about the insider threat and like those 3 flavors of insider that I mentioned, that's going to 100% introduce a vulnerability to your system. So I don't know how this sounds, but we put in a lot of equipment, we put in a lot of technology. It's awesome, but I think sometimes all that equipment and all that technology really masks what we're trying to do here in security. And the idea that you'll have this insider working in your organization despite all this technology, the technology can actually mask the risk that an insider might actually pose to your organization. So that in itself, the false sense of security, if you will, that comes with all that technology can actually introduce that vulnerability into your system.
Any other thoughts from Joe, Matt, Sean? Perfect. All right. Well, because we only have about 3 minutes left, and I kind of worry if we're going to be able to get an answer in that time, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. So thank you to our incredible panelists for sharing your insights, and thank you for everyone that joined today, especially those that asked questions and participated. It makes the sessions like this more impactful. I know I didn't get to all the questions, so we will try to answer them afterwards. But if today sparked ideas or challenges you want to explore further, please scan the QR codes provided to connect with either our panelists or their companies. I know I will personally be at GSX, so I would love to continue any conversations there. But on behalf of Gallagher, our entire team, and our panelists, thank you for attending Guarding the Gate High Security Site Design and Best Practices, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.